I'm standing here at the entrance of Trent University on the East Bank. It's no doubt a site that most of you will recognize. And it's an interesting place to start a field trip for the study of environmental history, because there's a lot of different aspects of environmental history that are represented right on this site. So I want to just spend a couple of minutes and identify a few of them. If we start here, over at the near the side of the road, we see a couple of large boulders. These are erratics. They're sitting right beside my bike. A couple of erratics, in other words, large boulders that at some point, perhaps 10, 12,000 years ago, they were picked up some distance to the north of Trent, somewhere on the Canadian Shield, and were picked up by the ice sheet, carried down here, and then as the ice sheet melted, they landed here. So they are remains of glacial history dating back about 10,000 years, and they're obviously the oldest object around here, the oldest sign of history. If we look elsewhere on the landscape within view of us, we can see signs of a later episode of the environmental history of Trent University, and that's the archaeological huts there near Zowski College. These huts were transported to the Trent campus from nearby sites, and they represent kind of the first generation of houses built by European settlers in this region, with basically logs that were cut down out of the forest and assembled here to build these huts. So they date probably, I'm guessing, probably from about the 1850s, 1860s or so. If we look elsewhere for a more recent, slightly more recent period, we see Mackenzie House here, which represents was a farmhouse until Trent was built. Dates from probably the late 1800s, perhaps the 1890s. And then also across the road here, we see the line of cedar trees that they follow along the road here, and they basically lots of cars going by. They basically follow along a line of a fence that used to be here. Most traces of the fence are gone, but at one point this marked the edge of a farm field where there was a cedar fence. And this line of cedars basically indicates where that fence used to be. You can often tell where a fence used to be, in fact, where there's a line of cedars on the edge of a field, and that there's a line of cedars here in this case probably because the cedar trees are able to sprout here and weren't eaten by cows that were in pasture here because they were protected by the fence. So that's another sign of the settlement history of the Trent University campus, probably dating from the late 1800s. If we look over on the other side of the road, we can see yet another episode of the environmental history of the Trent campus, and that is this old field here, right next to Pioneer Road. This field, until about 1969 or so, this field was a cow pasture, basically just grass growing here. Since that time, over the last 50 years, it's been recolonized by various species that spread very readily, such as goldenrod, as well as lots of cedar trees. So it represents kind of the part of the ecological history of the campus, especially the recovery of a field left to be left open to various species that are just blown here by the wind, including some species that are native to Canada and North America, and other species that came in with accompanied European colonizers, such as European buckthorn. And then finally, we see the most recent episode in environmental history right here at my feet. This is basically, as you can see, a monoculture of grass. It represents the classic example of an institutional landscape in which there's a single species of grass just planted here, which represents, among other things, the idea of the imposition of the idea of the institution on a landscape, imposing a particular idea about imposing a sense of order on nature. So what we have here, in short, at this one site is a whole representation of a whole series of episodes in the environmental history of Trent University, and in fact the history of the Peterborough region. And I find it interesting to think about this series of episodes as, in effect, a series of layers on the landscape, from the oldest layers here, such as the glacial erratics, to the more recent but still quite old layers, such as the various traces of European settlement history and the development of an agricultural economy, in terms of the oldest houses here, the archaeology log cabins, and then the Mackenzie House, an older farmhouse, and then also the line of cedar trees on the other side of the road, which follow the line of a farm fence here, and then an abandoned field here, which illustrates ecological history since Trent University took over this land, and then finally, as I said, the imposition of an institutional order in the form of a very heavily regulated grass monoculture here, a formation of an institutional landscape. So a whole series of layers in one place, and it's one of the things that make a particular place interesting in historical terms, to identify the series of layers that can be present in one single place, series of layers of the interweaving of human and ecological history. And so if you want to identify an interesting place in historical terms, look for a place where you can see several different layers of environmental history present in that one place.